Hey folks, if you're logging in to the Western Region CCA webinar, we're just going to give people a couple minutes to log in. So grab a cup of coffee, get comfortable, and we'll get this thing started here in just a couple minutes. We've had a lot of folks just log on, so just get comfortable. We'll get started here in a few minutes. Just give people some time to get settled in. And I'm going to come back on in about a minute and a half here, and we'll get going. So see you soon. Thank you. Do one more minute. Those numbers are still climbing on participants coming in, so hang tight if you're sitting there, and we'll get going. All right, well, it's 5 minutes after, so we are going to get started. We have about 150 people registered for this webinar, so thank you for your time, and thank you for carving out a couple hours out of your Friday here in December to talk about the agronomy of water. And I think you'll see our program here today covers water from the top, with our plants, and the crop protection materials that we put out, and adjuvants, and then the bottom, so the cleaning up your irrigation system, diagnosing issues with distribution uniformity, and salinity management, of course. So our hope is to, by the end of this, we get some credit hours, and there's 2 credit hours for the soil and water category. We will be showcasing that the QR code at the end, so you can use your CCA app to log in. If you don't have the CCA app, don't worry. We will be sending this off to Madison, Wisconsin, which is where the headquarters are, and they will get your hours recorded. So really the only difference is the speed. If you use that QR code, you will instantly have your hours applied to your account. If you use the old-fashioned way, because you don't have that app, it just goes a little bit slower, but you'll get your credits nonetheless. So make sure you do that. I wanted to introduce myself real quick. I'm Dr. Karl Wyant. I'm the Director of Agronomy at Nutrien, and I'm also the board chair for the Western Region CCA. So we've committed our membership to having these webinars so that we can support each other and making sure we're compliant with the CEU requirements every year. And we're excited to be able to present this program. And I think you'll see that we have an exciting lineup. Just a couple of other housekeeping notes. If you're just dialing in on a phone and you can't see the screen, that feature should be disabled. So you should be able to see the screen because there are graphics and data that we want you to see. So you can get your CEUs that way. If you have a question, please pop it in that Q&A and we will address it at the end of each presentation. And I think we'll have a good discussion. Finally, I mentioned the piece about the QR code. You have to stay to the end in order to get that. So please keep that in mind. And then we'll have a speaker contact info at the end of each presentation. So if you do have more questions or are interested in chatting further, you can get a hold of them. And then I'll go over that QR code piece again towards the end of the presentation. So let's chat about this agronomy of water, and then I can jump into my presentation. The theme of what we want to talk about today, and hopefully by the end you've written on a piece of paper or put it in your notes or somehow, is go take a water sample, because that's what we want to talk about, is the value of sampling your irrigation water or your spray water, because we can get a lot of utility out of it. Here on the left side of the screen is a PowerPoint clip art of a water sample, but it's what you can do with it. And so today we'll be talking about salinity management. Aaron Wingate will be chatting about that at the end of our presentation. We won't be talking about nutrient management per se, and in terms of like nitrate management and things like that. That's a whole other discussion, but that's certainly something you can get from a water sample. Molly Yeager from Apollo Group will be talking about irrigation efficiency and how to use a sample to look at issues with plugging of emitters. And then Joe Vaillancourt and I will be talking about how water and water quality impacts your spray programs. So we'll talk about adjuvants, and we'll talk about water conditioners. So lots of exciting reasons to take a sample. And here's how we're going to arrange the agenda. I'm on first. I'm going to talk about how this agronomy of water concept hopefully convince you to write down, take a water sample for a New Year's resolution, but then how to use that water sample to plan your water conditioners. And that's treating that spray water to make your ag chem program work better. And then Joe's going to talk about adjuvants and how to make your AI carrier, that's the water, work even better and work even harder. And then we'll go below ground or on the surface, and we'll start. Molly will cover the irrigation programs and how to take a water sample for cleaning out your irrigation. And then Aaron will close with salinity management. So really exciting program. Water connects the whole thing, and a water sample is really that key to diagnosing issues and predicting challenges in the field. So I'll go into my bit, ag chem performance and spray water quality. This is one of my favorite topics. One of my first uses of a water sample beyond just looking at graphs and whatnot and numbers was really trying to figure out why an ag chem product didn't work. I came up in the industry in the desert. We had a fungicide in Yuma that just wasn't working super well. We thought maybe it was resistance. We thought maybe it was these other challenges. Turns out it was just the water after we did all of our detective work. And I'll showcase how water quality can really beat up your spray water and your ag chem programs. So let's talk about your IPM checklist. You got to go scout for weeds and pests. We can't avoid that. First, you probably have to go get a PCA license if you want to make those chemical recommendations, right? So don't forget that. We are in California and Arizona. We have to have those PCA license to get that kind of work done. And then we have to read labels. We've got to know what we're doing. We've got to go through the different dosing rates so we can get to that recommendation, right? And then some of you are also out there in the field selecting spray tips for your growers. How do I match up spray tips to make sure I get the right droplet size or the right reduction in drift, things like that? Some of you are out there calibrating sprayers. So what's coming out of the nozzle actually is what you're recommending to apply. And then finally, don't forget to check your weather conditions. I'm sitting here in Denver, Colorado today, and it's probably about 40-mile-an-hour winds. outside, so that'd probably be a bad time to spray. But the one thing we don't often do, and hopefully I can convince you to do it by the end of my little talk, is to check the spray water quality. The stuff we're mixing all that expensive ag chem into, all that water, have we checked about the chemical makeup of that water, and what can we do about it to fix it? And so that'll be the topic of my presentation. And so here's that clip art coming back to haunt everybody. But here we have spray water, and we have 3 properties we're going to look at, because these 3 properties can impact the active ingredient in the actual ag chem product. So it's not that the product's bad, it's the chemistry that actually does the work that's getting beat up by pH, hardness, and bicarbonate. So we'll walk through 3 examples of how that can impact your product performance. And then just to remind the audience, what's the active ingredient? Remember, it's not the product. Here I just snagged a label, Roundup Power Max 3 herbicide. So we're not talking about the product, because there's several different products that contain the active ingredient, glyphosate. So that's what we're talking about. The thing that does the work, that's what's get impacted by your spray water, the active ingredient in the chemistry. So it's not a knock on the product, it's the specific reference to the active ingredient. So let's talk about some examples here. And we're going to use a real water sample to talk about some data here, just to kind of connect it into the real world, so it's not so theoretical. And some of you might recognize some of these properties, because on your own book of business or on your ranch, you are dealing with these challenges. So let's talk about pH. Here I have a real water sample, and we have a pH value here of 7.43, so it's slightly alkaline. Here we have some ratings about the different categories we can lump the pH into, and then we have a graphical representation of the challenge that pH might represent. So you can imagine higher pHs might have a more severe rating, or really acidic water might have a more severe rating. But the nice thing about these water samples, and more labs are getting kind of hip to this, is the interpretation. Instead of just giving you a number, they are giving you some sort of interpretive value. Here on my example, I have a slight to moderate risk of pH interacting with my ag chemistry. So we'll come back to this water sample when we talk about hardness and bicarbonate. But you can see every water we have, whether it's the irrigation water or spray water, has a different set of properties. And that's why taking that water sample is so important. So you're not assuming anything, you're actually dialing in that issue and solving the problem. So what does pH do to your active ingredient? Out west, we tend to have alkaline or basic water, and we have this challenge of something called alkaline hydrolysis. And this is when the water pH actually breaks up, or you can chop up active ingredients, and those chopped up ingredients then reassemble into stuff that's totally useless. So the alkaline pH reduces the strength or efficacy of your active ingredient. And so I mentioned these new chopped up combinations, because of the pH, don't have those benefits you're looking for. They don't act like the same original active ingredient. So we can measure this. We call it half-life. Every crop protection product that has to go through the EPA has to measure their half-life, because it's a way that the product actually, or the active ingredient, dissipates in the environment. So the environmental fate data, we can look at that data to say, how much time does it take in this alkaline pH for the strength of the product to be reduced by 50%. So how many days, how many minutes, how many hours? There's a wide range of times here. So here's some examples, and this is from a great document that I stumbled upon trying to figure out this fungicide issue years ago in Yuma. And so it's from the University of Florida Extension System. Here they have different active ingredients, so not products, but active ingredients, and they have different half-life times where the strength decreases by half every time in an alkaline pH. So I'll show you an example here for Captain, a popular fungicide. If you put that fungicide in a tank mix that's a pH of 8, you will reduce the strength by half every 10 minutes. So you let an hour go by, you know how much active ingredient left to do the work. If it's a really high pH like 9, it's every 2 minutes. But to contrast that, with something else on this list. Let's just say this methomyl ingredient. Here you have 20 weeks. So you mix that product and you won't lose, in a pH of 8, you won't lose that active ingredient strength for 20 weeks. So there's considerable variance here across active ingredients and their susceptibility to alkaline hydrolysis. So that's why looking at your product suite and talking with an advisor is so important, because they can help you figure out which ones are the most susceptible, which ones do you really need to solve the pH issue for, and maybe which ones aren't going to present as big of a problem. So great document. I'll give you a second to write that down so you can go look it up. It's on Google, it's free. Okay, we'll move on. Let's go on to hardness. And here, my real life water report. Some of you in the audience might actually recognize this, these properties and be able to pinpoint where we got this thing from. But here's water hardness. And here I have a test result of 835. And here, probably most importantly, is the interpretation. What does it mean? So if you're above 180 milligrams per liter, you have a severe hardness issue. And of course, you look at our chart here, the big red bar, severe issue. Hardness in this water is a big challenge. I mentioned the pH issue. It's a slight to moderate. Water hardness, this is an immediate red flag and literally a big red bar on the screen. So we'll talk about what water hardness is and then talk about how it impacts your ag chem. So what is water hardness? Water hardness is the presence of metals, calcium, iron, manganese, and magnesium, and they're present in the solution and they cause this issue of water hardness. And so here we have this table from the World Health Organization where they can classify, these different levels. And I'll just give you guys like I don't know, I'll tell you the end of the joke here, the punchline. But most of our water out west, California, Arizona, that you're going to go test is this extremely hard to hard levels. And so we have a challenge with hardness. We have lots of little spicy bits in our water, and this can cause problems. And here's a way to measure it. So what happens? I know some of you are looking for a tattoo idea. It is Christmas. This is what glyphosate looks like when you draw out the structures, and that might be giving some of you nightmares of chemistry class. I'm sorry. But this is a glyphosate. This is when it works. This form of glyphosate and shape will work just fine. So we'll give it a big green circle, big green light. Let's go kill some weeds. Let's make it happen. Well, let's look at the same ingredient, active ingredient, under hardness, water hardness conditions. And again, remember our sample came back as severe water hardness. Let's look at that. When you put one of those metal cations, calcium, manganese, magnesium, and iron, into your tank, you can actually bend the shape of the glyphosate. And here's that M2, that's the metal. You can bend that glyphosate into what looks like a stop sign. And the punchline here is you bend it into a stop sign, that glyphosate will stop working. That type of glyphosate won't kill weeds. So we have one of those circles with a slash through it, not going to work out. So you've got to deal with water hardness because it changes the physical shape of your active ingredient, and it could really reduce that efficacy of your program. So again, I mentioned that there's certain types of crop protection program that are more susceptible to this water hardness than others. Here I have a list, and this one take-home message is that the weak acid herbicide category is very susceptible to water hardness. So here we have some classics on the list: 2,4-D, dicamba, glufosinate, glyphosate. All these ingredients we look at every day, depending on your territory and your crop mix. And then you have some product names there. So lots of challenges with water hardness, especially in this weak acid herbicide. So take a look at this, jot some notes down about your spray season that's coming up. Some of you are still spraying, depending on where you're at. Some of you have a busy spray season coming up this spring. So lots of challenges here with water hardness. So let's move to bicarbonates. And so we've moved our green arrow a little bit. And here in a real life water sample, we have 303 milligrams per liter. Here's some interpretation. And here's our nice little graph for a quick analysis. We've got a slight to moderate challenge with this sample on bicarbonates. So let's talk about what that means. So bicarbonates, one thing to think about with bicarbonates, the concentration of bicarbonates is dependent on the pH of the water. So they're like a 2-for-1. And I'll show you a graph here in a second that really kind of spells that out. When you have high bicarbonates, you tend to have high pH. So that they gotta go hand in hand with each other. And so there's a dual effect of bicarbonates. If you have lots of bicarbonates in your water, you can directly antagonize your ag chem products. So they have a hard time working. The other challenge is related to pH. If you have high bicarbonates, it can be really difficult to bring the pH down as you move into your water conditioners. You might have to apply a higher dose than normally, maybe the top of that label range, to get the pH to change, because bicarbonates can buffer pH, the lowering of the pH of the water. So just keep that in mind. Let's focus on the impact on the ag chem products here in a second. The other thing is that with high bicarbonates, and I'm talking really high, like severe, big red graph on that water sample, you can actually have some trouble with getting the herbicide into the crop, the uptake piece, if it's a systemic, and that can be a challenge. So that's on really high bicarbonate water. But one thing to think about is who's affected. And I like to say it's the DIMs. And so cethoxidum, clethodim, tralcoxidum, and don't make fun of me if I'm saying these names wrong, 2,4-D. So these DIMs and 2,4-D can be really susceptible to interactions with bicarbonates. So remember, a couple of different impacts here with bicarbonates. The buffering piece, if you have really high bicarbonate water, it's going to be, you're going to need more product to lower the pH. So make sure you have those pH test strips and those meters available to see if you're hitting the mark. And then the other thing is that reduction of the herbicide uptake and that direct antagonism. So let's talk about moving forward. We're certified crop advisors. We're about grabbing that data and then doing something to solve the problem. So let's talk about solving the problem. So I hope I've convinced you to take a water sample if that's a new activity for you. I like to use labs that provide good interpretation and easy interpretation. So keep that in mind when you're selecting your lab. Ask them to help you out. What do these results mean? So then you can get to this question, now what? What do I do? Well, I think there's a kind of a dual path here. And you've got to have the water sample to really help you out. So we've grabbed that. That's this blue box here on the left. We have our data. And now we have a decision tree. The easy decision tree is the first option here. I'll mark it with a 1. And that's if you just have a pH or a bicarbonate issue. You can treat that water pH and you can impact the bicarbonates at the same time. It's a 2-for-1. I'll show you on a graph that walks you through that. The real challenge here is with the hardness, because we often have high pH, high bicarbonates, and hardness. And so that takes a different approach. So we have the second approach. So we'll walk through the nuance here. Well, let's start with number 1, kind of the easy one. It's you just have a pH and a bicarbonate issue. So that's this plot here. And this is called a Verdesian plot. If you really want some random trivia for your Christmas dinner with your family. But here we have pH on the x-axis. So we have 4 really acidic water. And then we have a pH of 12 right on the right, which is, I don't know, like oven cleaner or something. Most of our water isn't quite that alkaline. But what I want you to pay attention to is the different forms of carbon that's in this water. So when you drop your tank mix into an acidic pH, CO2 is the primary carbon species in that spray water now. And that's relatively harmless. When you have really high pH, you have carbonate, which is CO3 2-. And so to have carbonate dominate your spray water system, I mean, you got to have a pH of over 11. So that doesn't happen very often. What happens most of the time is you have a water sample that comes back between 6.5 and I'd say a little lower than 9. That's the bicarbonate here, HCO3-. So what I want to call your attention to is this downward slope here, this dashed blue line. That's how much the relative abundance of bicarbonate in the system. As you drop your pH, look how quickly your bicarbonate drops with it. Remember, it's pH related. So if you correct for your pH, you make your tank mix acidic, you're going to get rid of the bicarbonate at the same time. It's a 2-for-1. It's an easy step. Don't forget your pH strip so you can make sure you're hitting that exact number that's on the label of pH you need to be mixing in. The water hardness piece takes a different approach. You need to have some sort of ammonium sulfate or ammonium sulfate replacement. There's other products on the market that can tie up those metal cations. Here I'm just showing you an example of how ammonium sulfate works. You add your ammonium sulfate here to the tank mix, the calcium, a hard metal cation, it could be iron, it could be manganese, it could be magnesium, attaches itself to the sulfate. And now you have a hard metal cation that can no longer react with your active ingredient and turn it into a stop sign, which won't work for you. The challenge here is that the dose of your water conditioner that has this hardness element, you've got to scale it with how hard the water actually is. So I've consulted on spray water programs where they're using the lower end of the rate of the water conditioner. It's not quite keeping up with just how hard that water actually is. So we made a couple of changes and solved some problems. Let's do some closing statements, and please ask questions in the Q&A. I'd love to take some. So hopefully I've convinced you to take a water sample. If you want to make your active ingredients, which are super expensive, work even harder, that water sample can be a great place to start to really dial in some of these negative impacts that we can have. One thing I also want to call attention to is the variability of water. One farm shop, one branch location, wherever you're mixing up your tanks, that water can be so different from just even a few miles between each other. So you could be thinking, oh, I've got good water here, but just down the road where you're making tank mixes, you don't have good water. So quantify it and make sure you know what you're mixing. And I say, take a sample at least once a year, know what you're getting into. And then if you need more advice on this, that's where I think the crop advisors come in. A number of you have experience in this space, and a number of you can comment on that and really help dial in some nice programs on water conditioners. So that's my last slide. I wanted to include some resources for you to write down. The big one here is this top one from Purdue, PPP number 86. It's one of their extension documents. The impact of water quality on pesticide performance. If you want 150 pages of what I just went through, this one's got it all. It's free. You can Google it, and it's a great resource. Certainly one I referenced heavily during my talk. If you really want to dial in some of this alkaline hydrolysis, the cutting and reduction of half the strength of the active ingredient, this pesticide properties database, you can actually type in active ingredients and go say, oh, this product is more susceptible. You know, it has a half-life of 15 minutes, or this product doesn't quite have as much as ours. So it can help you plan and make a custom approach. And then you have a nice document there from Michigan State University. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen. I will check the Q&A and see if we have any questions. So I don't see any questions from the audience. I've given this talk before, and the question I mainly get is, how do I know? How do I know if I'm going to have an issue with my crop protection program? A great place to start, again, water sample and get that interpretation. Have that lab tell you this number on hardness, bicarbonate, or the pH, this is what it means in terms of your spray water. And that can be a great place to start. I see 3 questions coming in. A question is, in the West, we have mostly hard water. Why haven't we seen more problems with herbicide applications? Why haven't manufacturers spent more time on this issue? I don't have a name here, but that is a great question. I've spoken with some PCAs that have been in the industry for 35, 40 years. They tell me that when they were starting in the industry, this was some information that was actually presented at label update meetings and lunches and things like that. But just over time, some of this information, for whatever reason, I don't know, has become a lot not discussed as much. So I'm not quite sure why. We do have hard water in the West. I think the reason why we don't see as many problems with herbicide applications is because we see a lot of folks are using water conditioners as a standard practice. So I think given the popularity of water conditioning, we just don't run into it as much as maybe we would if this was new technology. But there's always someone out there that's not using it, and I think there's always room for improvement. We'll do one more question here. Seth asks, by treating water hardness, will there be any potential clogging issues from the precipitation of the metals? Yes, this can happen. And it's on those cases where it's very hard water, you're more than likely going to have to do something to keep those nozzles clean, get those nozzles cleaned out occasionally, because you can have some challenges with precipitation. And it can not just be, issues with the water conditioner you're putting in there. It can also be issues with the things that are also in your tank mix. If you're putting out a foliar product, it can interact with water hardness and cause clogging. So super hard water is always a challenge. And I think it's just something to keep your eye out on. Here we're solving for active ingredient strength, but just keep an eye on that precipitation piece. So I will sit here and answer the rest of these questions while Joe is presenting. So Joe, that's a great cue to you to bring there you are. Hey, Joe. Joe is going to talk to us about the use of adjuvants in water, and Joe joins us from Verdesian. Thank you for joining us, Joe, and the floor is yours.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. That, little N that I saw on your slides is somewhat familiar to me, Dr. W. Before being the biostimulants manager here at Verdesian Life Sciences, I was the adjuvants and plant nutrition manager over at Loveland Products. So spent a lot of time around adjuvants, and I thought you did a great job driving home a lot of points about water conditioners. I got to say, just before I begin, in my experience being the adjuvants manager over at Nutrien and Loveland, that water quality was the most overlooked, I would say, part of a spray application in my experience. So can't be overstated. If you got perfect water, hell, let me know where you are. I'll buy an acre and call myself a farmer. So anyway, my name is Joe Vaillancourt. I'm now the biostimulants product manager at Verdesian Life Sciences. I'm calling just north, actually, of where Dr. Wyant is today, near Loveland, Colorado. So just want to walk through some different adjuvant types. Dr. W did a good job talking over water conditioners, and I'm just merely a marketing guy. So as far as the technical stuff goes, it doesn't get much better than that. But I will go over some of the other offerings that are out there. So really, I just want to start at the very beginning, like what an adjuvant even means as a term. And I don't think it matters that it's from the late 16th century Latin, but it really means helping towards. And that's exactly what we're doing here. Adjuvants aren't going to kill anything. They're not going to take any disease away. They're not going to kill any insects. There are some exceptions to this just by the physical state of some of these materials. But by and large, you're not going to be providing any crop protection with the use of an adjuvant. What you're going to be doing is delivering that active ingredient system from the crop protection materials that you're applying to allow them to behave better or influence the behavior of that spray droplet, generally speaking. So adjuvants do, like I said, influence that physical behavior of a spray solution, but they're not going to provide any sort of nutritional or crop protection benefits. There are some exceptions to that rule, but for most adjuvants you see out there, they won't do that. You got to think too, there's a lot of things working against that spray application. Like nature doesn't care what you're spraying or when you're spraying it or how you're spraying it or how you want that spray droplet to behave. But that's what adjuvants are for. And sometimes it's like the last thing a grower might think about putting in their tank, but it really can have a profound effect on the efficacy of that spray solution. These are just some, this is not an exhaustive list by any means. So wind, rain, sun or photo degradation, drought, too little moisture, soil conditions, like loose and sandy soils, saline soils, that tank mixture that Dr. W was alluding to earlier. Are those materials going to play together? Your water quality, that was covered. The leaf, the size of the leaf and structure of the leaf, and even the nature of the cuticles in that leaf, the nature of the active ingredients that you have. Are they systemic chemistries? Are they contact chemistries? We need those sprays to behave very differently between those two different modes of action. What I'm saying here really is there's an adjuvant that can help mitigate these performance factors, if you will. There's an adjuvant for that. So there's a lot of these available. A lot of them have gray areas and can take care of more than one thing. So if it's a windy day, maybe you want a polyacrylamide thickener that's been closely associated with dicamba applications out in the Midwest. Really get those heavy droplets, so the wind won't have quite an effect. Maybe we're applying a systemic chemistry like glyphosate, put an oil system in there to really drive that chemistry into the plant. Different adjuvants do different things, and different. They're not all equal. There is a tremendous variability in the quality of these adjuvants as well. So trusted suppliers are often your best bet. Now here's a label that I practically know by heart. LI 700, you might be familiar with this product. I believe it is the best-selling adjuvant of all time across the globe. This is the 700th iteration of the adjuvants they were trying to put together at Loveland Products about 52 years ago now. This product's been on the market. So Loveland Industry 700 is what it stands for. But here's some different parts of a label that are really important, right? Here's the claims that you're going to see toward the top. Got to provide some sort of proof of those claims as a manufacturer, or the materials that you use that are already known to provide a certain effect will be accepted as well. So that's closely looked at. And then what's in it? I'll call it a quote unquote active ingredient here, but since we're really not providing any crop protection, the official term is principal functioning agents, and those are the materials that are influencing the spray droplet behavior. We have application directions, of course, that can be clear or clear as mud sometimes, as we all know. And then signal words, which of course are quite important out west. So these are typical elements that you're going to see on pretty much any adjuvant label. So those are certainly the most important ones. All right, for liquid adjuvants, you often find a volume to volume rate structure, okay? It was a little, look, I'm not a mathologist, so it took me a little while to get used to this. I always thought about it in quarters. A quart, there's 4 quarts to a gallon, of course, and a lot of times these volume to volumes will be right on the money with a quarter rate, right? So 0.125% volume to volume is 1 pint or 16 ounces per 100 gallons. So I like to think of that 0.125, it's like 12.5 cents. I like to think of these as kind of being in a quarter, right? 0.25%, well, that's kind of like a quarter, right? That's a quart rate, 32 ounces per 100 gallons. And the list continues. This is the typical structure for surfactant systems, water conditioners, things like that. Your oil-based systems to line up with herbicide and systemic herbicides is usually in a pint or quart per acre rate structure, but your surfactant systems will mostly be, and water conditioners will mostly be like this, that are liquid. Okay, I want to start running through some of the categories here and be timely on this, certainly. So surfactants and organosilicone. What do these things do? You see the term non-ionic surfactants out there. That just means it's either a neutral or net neutral charge associated with that material, and shouldn't interfere as far as again, active material charges go that you usually need to preserve that sort of thing in order for those to be effective. Non-ionic surfactants, highly compatible, and that's what you're going to use across almost any sort of application in which you're looking for spreading and reducing the surface tension of water. Okay, you can see, I don't know why I put surfactant here next to the 72 dynes. That should say no surfactant, as you can see that beautiful bead of water sitting on a highly hydrophobic surface there. You can tell just a tiny little bit of that that sphere is making contact with that surface. Not exactly what you want when it comes to a spray application. We're looking for a greater surface area of this material to come in contact with that leaf surface, much less getting it to stay there, which we'll talk about later. Now, a surfactant included will cut those dynes, the force it takes to break that water molecule apart, the surface tension of it, if you will. It'll about halve that at a quart rate, at least with like a Liberate sort of LI 700 sort of product. And that would that would reduce that surface tension quite a bit, as you can see in this USDA photo. But there are different levels to this. Like I said, not all surfactants are created equally. Organosilicones will provide extreme wetting and get those dynes down to about 20. Now that's spreading a real thin layer across your surface area, whatever that target may be. Now, would I recommend that for a soybean blowing in the breeze in eastern Nebraska? Absolutely not, because that material is so thin, it'll just wash right off the leaf, and it's so windy, and that leaf surface is so wide that the likelihood of that material staying on a soybean plant like that is pretty low, especially with windy Nebraska conditions. Would I recommend this an organosilicone for a fresh citrus application there in the valley? Absolutely, I would, because we need that fungicide to stick on that citrus plant and cover as much of that fresh market fruit and make that perfect and pretty, like city folks like me like to consume their fruits and vegetables. So it really depends on what behavior you're looking to get out of that spray, right? Different materials require different behaviors, and there's different options to influence those behaviors. So on a scale here, we'd have organosilicones being the thinnest, most slipperiest, and spreading the most, all the way down to no adjuvant system or an in-can system that'll provide just a little bit of spreading. Oftentimes for most of your sprays, you're going to want to stick right to that 80-20, 90-10, and that just really indicates there's 90% principal functioning agents, and those are often found as alcohols, simple alcohols. In these surfactant systems, with 10% being inert material. Most of the time, that's just water. Same with 80-20 there. Okay, so that is a rundown on surfactant systems. Think about your conditions out there, what type of chemistry, what market it's for, and what's in the tank. That's really what you need to evaluate. How do I want this spray droplet to behave? Moving right along to oils. Oils, you know how you get that bottle of oil, comes in either glass or plastic, and it's always got that film on it. You know, you open it once and then it seems like the whole bottle's been dipped in oil. Well, oil loves to escape, it loves to move, it loves to try to get out of that container that it's in. And that's exactly what it does with spray adjuvant, or with spray applications and crop input. Those glyphosate applications, systemic, you're only going to get what's absorbed by the plant. This is a perfect tank mix partner for something like that. Your burn down materials, you want a high oil content in that adjuvant system. Okay, surfactants will provide some penetration ability as well, but certainly not to the tune of oils. You'll often see these two mixed together, providing both that spreading and that penetrant quality. Okay, so some of the worries or watchouts you might have with an oil is leaf cupping, getting a little burn there. Might get a little aggressive. It's often just a cosmetic response. You know, as a marketing guy, it's easy to say, "Hey, that's how you can tell that it's working." No, the oil is the carrier, and getting that crop input material really driven into the plant. I mean, there's no better way to tell. What's actually happening there is you're damaging the cuticle, or sorry, you're damaging the cell walls within the plant, and it just causes those leaves to cup a little bit. Again, oftentimes it's just cosmetic, but think about what you need here, because if you do heat up that tank mix too much and it's too aggressive, you can certainly smoke plants, particularly young ones. So there's a few different types of oil systems out there. You've probably heard of MSOs and COCs. MSO is a methylated seed oil, usually coming from soybean or cotton, something like that. That really is the most aggressive system. Crop oil concentrates, you'll usually find in a blend with surfactant systems. Those are petroleum based in organic materials, and this still provides a very good level of penetrant, but backs off just a little bit. So if you do have some concerns, probably better to take a crop oil concentrate. If there's not one available, you're still going to get better penetrant activity with a surfactant compared to what's in can, and then no adjuvant system is probably the weakest one. You don't see a ton of oils put in the can in formulation, and gosh, you don't really see a great level of quality adjuvants even in the can. So when it comes to surfactants, look, a lot of these companies, some of which I may have been employed by, their primary focus isn't the adjuvant system. It's the crop input, whether it's a herbicide or it's a plant nutrition product, something like that. So going to a supplier that truly specializes in these sorts of systems is certainly your best bet. You're never getting a top quality adjuvant system when it's in the can. Oh yeah, look at this. I forgot I do a little art too. So an oil system, yeah, going after weeds, burn down, that's where I really, really like an oil system. All right, spreader stickers. This is a really mind-blowing concept. These adjuvant systems help those active materials both spread on the leaf surface and stick to that leaf surface. I know, an absolutely wild concept. This sort of material I really like for those contact chemistry, right? Particularly in insecticides and fungicides. If you're looking for again something to adhere to a leaf surface a little bit better than what you have with just a straight surfactant, spreader stickers exactly what you're going to want to go with. There are some natural materials like pinylene, essentially pine tar that gets emulsifiers added to it, and just acts as you would think it would, right? A very sticky sort of substance that can provide that adherence to a leaf surface, whether it's thin, thick, blowing in the wind, what have you. This can be very helpful for rain fastness as well, if you're looking to get a material on before rain in the forecast. And I really like that pinylene sort of product if you're going with a soil applied contact chemistry. It tends to not break down as quickly and really stick on the surface of the soil. So for some of those soil applied contact insecticides, these can be nice. There's also latex, resins, things like that available. Like when you're painting your house, you know you're not that good of a painter, even though it looks smooth on your wall, whether it's textured or not, something's getting that paint in those little crevices, right? It's latex that's doing that. So think of a similar sort of action here. You put something like that in your spray tank, and it's going to provide, once it hits that leaf surface, kind of that spreading, sticking, very smooth sort of quick drying activity. Okay. Spreader stickers have been around for a while. That was one of the first adjuvants. I'm not going to go over water conditioners because Dr. Dub did such a good job already. Look, I went to Michigan State. We already had a Michigan State reference on the pesticide half-lives. I've used that article so many times. I've used that so many times. That is a very good resource. I'm not just saying that because I was Spartan. But essentially what's going on with a water conditioner is you got blockers, okay, preventing those hard water cations from linking up to with your herbicide or nutritional and essentially rendering them inactive. So tough year for the boys this year, but I got to give it up to Ken Flocker, who last year provided me many happy Saturdays. So essentially, just remember this: if your herbicide or crop input is the ball carrier, that big beefy offensive line is going to be the water conditioner, preventing the tacklers from getting there. I'm a simple guy, you guys. I'm just a simple guy. All right, drift reduction agents. This has become quite an ordeal out in the Midwest, where over-the-top dicamba has now become a common practice. A little bit of dicamba can take out a lot of specialty crops, and you get your occasional tomatoes and cucurbits out there in the Midwest, and both the physical and gas drift of or movement, I should say, of that dicamba product really ushered in regulations to get that spray droplet as thick as possible, because if it's even a little bit windy, we don't want to deal with that drift over to our neighbor's field. So drift reduction agents are essentially thickeners, long chain polymers. Verdesian actually has some really nice technology, long chain polymers that would fit this space quite well. Look, I don't always recommend these sorts of products. I'm trained the Loveland way on adjuvants, and I still believe that your best spray droplet size is going to be right in the middle. It's three little bears style here. Okay, one's too small, it's gonna drift away. One's too big, it'll bounce, shatter off the leaf. You really want that perfect size, but hey, sometimes it doesn't always work out that way. It's a windy day out there, and we need to get spraying. That's when it's time to throw a thickener, a drift reduction agent in the tank. You're gonna find two common systems here. One being the long chain polymers that I've referenced, the other being a guar gum. And that's a little bit more natural. It really just depends on which kind of supplier you're going with. These have popped up all over the marketplace in the last couple of years because of dicamba. A lot of them have a little bit of water conditioner, surfactant, oil systems, that kind of stuff. Look, if you need to reduce drift with your spray and make those droplets heavier so they're not affected by wind, just go with one of these guars or one of these long chain polymers. If you're dealing with water, you're dealing with surfactant, I'd recommend just adding another tank, to be honest with you. Okay. All right. So then you've got some other sorts of materials as well that can help, and some of these are very straightforward. Soil surfactants is one of a lot of tight soils there too out on the West Coast. The ground's been run for years and years, that sort of thing. Soil surfactants can help that material, and instead of affecting the crop input that you're putting in, it's going to have an active response and attach itself to those soil particles, which will allow for a better movement or retention as well within a soil profile. So for soil applied chemistries, I know Loveland offered like Water Max. That really did a nice job of penetrating that first several inches of the soil and then keeping that moisture there. It wouldn't just flush it right down. So if you got issues with either pooling or with too loose of soils and water draining out too quickly, a soil surfactant might be a way to go. Helps retain that moisture with usually the use of a polymer. Desalination products, I know this can be an issue in some parts of the West as well. these are soil applied adjuvant systems, and they really just mitigate that sodium in the root zone, and help break apart those calcium deposits that you'll see, you know, those white bumps all around in those saline soils. So Desaltis is probably the best known brand out there, but that's from Aquatrolls, and that really is probably the best desalinant adjuvant system that I've seen. Tank line and equipment cleaners, guys, this is one I would not skimp on. Find a quality cleaner for your tank. As you guys know, it'll just save your spray system, save you a bunch of headache later. There's two broad categories: ammonium based, non-ammonium based. I know Loveland Products offers both. Again, there's plenty of options out there on the marketplace. All clear was what I would always recommend, and then of course your typical triple rinse sort of approach. Compatibility agents, Dr. W talked about this a little bit too. Hey, sometimes materials don't like playing together. You got water-based materials, you got oil-based materials, you got ECs, you got SCs, you got non-concentrated materials, you got stuff that's like 99.8% water sometimes. Sometimes they don't always like to play together. A compatibility agent is a surfactant-like material, and it just helps blend various chemistries together. Usually they require some water to activate as well. And that can really help if you're seeing quick separation or multiple materials not going in. This is a great jar test solution. You know, you do your jar test, you see things aren't mixing all that great. This is an easy way to attempt to rectify that. Defoamers and anti-foam, another mind-blowing concept. They take away foam. Defoamers are going to take away foam that's existing in the spray tank already. So you poured everything in, it's bubbling up, you spray a little on the top. Gosh, I used to do this demo with beer. Easily my favorite demo. You pour a couple beers, you show how the defoamer works, then you pour a third one for yourself for all the hard work after. An anti-foam is going to prevent foam from building up in the spray tank. So one preventative, one curative. Oftentimes they'll both be working the same stuff. Spray markers and foam markers, those are, pardon me, are often used in roadside sort of applications, just to show where the material's been sprayed. They'll create a little bit of foam or a dye, those sorts of things. So there are other adjuvant systems as well. There's all-in-one type systems that have a defoamer, a drift reduction agent, a water conditioner, a surfactant, and an oil system all in one. You know, just think about what you really need out of that spray tank environment. Yes, it's easy to just grab that one and put it in the tank every time, but it's kind of you know, when you're focused on solving one of these spray fail factors versus focused on a plethora of fail factors, you just get probably more efficacy out of the one with a narrower scope of what it's looking to test. Look, I just want to provide a quick summary here. I do have some videos on this stuff that I posted on Twitter back when I was with Loveland and Nutrien. Just simple demos. And if you want to find out for yourself how something works, or if you want to show your growers, heck, it's easy to get a surfactant, get some water, make a quick simple mixture, you know, do it treated versus untreated on a cabbage leaf, or something that has a real kind of thick waxy layer that'll really make that water beat up if you do the untreated. So there are really nice ways to show how effective adjuvant systems can be, and there's good water conditioning demos as well, particularly for the folks at Loveland Products or at Nutrien. Look, guys, there's a ton of adjuvant systems available. You gotta realize, what do you want out of this spray application? What is going on? What are my biggest fail factors that I need to overcome? Okay, that is the first step in thinking and selecting about what adjuvant system to use. More adjuvants does not mean a better spray. Oh my God, I've seen so many gummed up tanks in my life, okay? there is certainly a cliff and slope and cliff to this. Follow the rate structure. Just dumping in more adjuvants isn't going to make it spread more. There's an effect to that. That's why you never see surfactant applications with 4% volume to volume. Well, that wouldn't be a very strong material if you needed to pour in 4 gallons every 100 gallons. So these are some things to just be wary and watch out for as well. Follow that rate structure. They're rated for a reason. Utilize resources and expertise. Go to trusted suppliers. The folks at Nutrien have a rich history in adjuvants. Simplot has a rich history in adjuvants through their Invictus pickup. Wilbur Ellis has very high quality adjuvants. Helena, high quality adjuvants. I'm kind of taking off the retailers, sure, but that's oftentimes where you're going to find your trusted solutions. I would stick to those. There's some label games you can certainly play out there. I like to joke around. All you need is an Amazon account, a bathtub, and a boat, or you can basically make your own adjuvant system. So just be wary about what's out there and follow the folks that you trust. And know what's in your tank. That is the most important thing. Know everything that's going in that spray tank. You can't make an educated adjuvant system decision without knowing every bit of that. Okay, so at the end of the day, adjuvants are really all about influencing that physical spray behavior on from a crop protection spray or even a plant health spray. So if you need any help, there are several resources out there. Here are some of my favorites. My guy, Brian Young over at Purdue University, the Compendium of Herbicide Adjuvants, man, this thing lists a ton of brand names, all those principal functioning agents, the rates of them, the pH, some of those physical properties, if you will. Absolutely love that. It's available for free. I think the last edition is 2016, and he was working on a new one. Every few years kind of comes out with a new one. So search for that one. If you get this PowerPoint, that's linked there. Your ag retailer, of course, and their preferred supplier. UC has some good data as well on a lot of adjuvant systems. So if that's an avenue that you choose to go down and trust, I really like UC. And then Agri. Every label for what's available really in California and most of on the West Coast is going to be on Agri, and you can search by principal functioning agent, you can search by brand name, you can search by adjuvant type even. So that can be really helpful as you're navigating the different choices that are out there. Dr. Dove, I tried to talk as fast as I can. That is about all I had.
Joe, thank you. That was fantastic, and thanks you for the review of the adjuvants. We do have a question in the Q&A. I'll read it off. Are there some surfactants that may hinder biological fungicides?
Yes, and I would say there are, and I wouldn't even stop with biological fungicides either. Oftentimes that is a pH issue. So be sure to look at the pH and go to that biological supplier and say, hey, what kind of adjuvant systems have you used with this? They should know that information before they commercialize a product. I'm sure that they've run some tests of different adjuvant systems. I'd say that is most closely related to that pH. Li 700 is going to be a really low pH. It's a sweet spot for glyphosate, kind of keeps it in that medium. You put that in with something like that class of wheat herbicide, that sulfonylurea herbicides. That is the opposite of what you want to do. If anything, you want to raise pH for those SUs. But I digress. I'm getting into herbicides. For biologicals, yes, please take a look at that acidity. Most surfactants, I think you'll be okay. Your best bet is to check with the supplier. There's such a variance in those live organisms.
Joe, I think you make a great point about that relationship, that trusted relationship of the advisor and being able to give quality, hey, here's the product, here's what we got to do, here's the right approach to solving the issue. I think that's a solid point. just to the audience, there aren't any other questions. So we will have Joe's contact information in the chat later. Please, Joe, if you don't mind, if they could ask you any other questions or maybe talk about that beer experiment that you mentioned earlier for the weekend, that'd be good. But thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks, y'all. And thanks for your service to our industry.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Joe. Appreciate it. So next we've been talking about water and the agronomy of water above ground. Next, we're going to start going below ground and we're going to talk about irrigation. So Molly Yeager is going to come on next, and she's from the Apollo group. And she is going to talk about how to take a water sample and how to use it to diagnose irrigation issues. So Molly, if you want to share your screen, the stage is yours.
All right. Thank you, Karl. Again, my name is Molly Yeager. I am the Northern California Sales Manager with Apollo Ag Technologies. To give you a little introduction to myself, I'm a licensed PCA. I worked for Will Borellis Company in Northern California for about 5 years. And then I worked for the ag department as a biologist. And I'm sure you guys have all encountered working with ag biologists, and going from a PCA to being the unfun was very tough. I feel like it made me stronger in this field though, because I do understand the regulatory side of things much better than I did even when I was a PCA. Moving on from that, I sold fertilizer and plant extracts with an Italian company. And then I came on board with Apollo Ag Technologies about 2 years ago. And so my bread and butter right now is water, and being out in California and experiencing the drought, it's a very hot topic. And when I was a PCA, I wish I would have had the water treatment knowledge that I do have now. So I hope I can share a little bit of my expertise and knowledge with you guys that you guys can take out to the field and to your growers. So some things we're going to cover in my presentation is water treatment basics, distribution uniformity. I often refer to that as DU, so you may hear me use that interchangeably. How to improve your distribution uniformity, and then I'm sure we'll have some time at the end for questions. So what is water treatment? Agriculture water treatment is farm management methods that focus on controlling various undesirable factors within the water to enhance quality and overall efficiency of farming operations. So if you look at the image below, water treatment isn't anything new. I mean, 4000 BC, the Indians and ancient Greeks were using charcoal filters to purify their water. Moving on up into the 1900s, that's when industrial and agriculture water treatment really took off by using man-made chemicals. So some common terms that I use in water treatment, and I often get asked by the growers that I'm speaking with that to define these terms to them. So maybe you can help your growers with these. Bicarbonates. So bicarbonate is just HCO3. It's an anion. It commonly bonds with calcium and magnesium, and it is correlated with high pH, as Karl said earlier. So scaling, that's another one. When a bicarbonate will bind with calcium or magnesium, it'll form deposits. Oftentimes on that irrigation line, you'll see like white flaky material, and that's scaling. Rule of thumb, what I like to tell growers and crop advisors to do, if you can wipe it off with your hand, it's probably fertilizer. If you have to flake it off and it's really hard to get off, that's a good indicator that it is scaling. Biofilm is a thin, slimy layer of bacteria that adheres to a surface. So oftentimes within the drip line, you'll get biofilm accumulation, and that's just from bacteria being present in the water. Distribution uniformity, that is a method to measure an irrigation system's performance. And then pH, that's the abbreviation for potential hydrogen. It's just a figure expressing the acidity or alkalinity of a solution on a logarithmic scale. So as you all know, the pH scale is 0 to 14. So some water treatment basics, whether you are a grower or you are the crop advisor, some steps that I highly recommend you use when testing water or discussing potential problems with water with your client is to pull that initial water analysis. I don't know how many times I have growers or PCAs tell me, well, I have a water sample from 2 years ago. Water is constantly changing. So that's one thing that I highly suggest we all do our due diligence and pull that water sample at least annually. If you know that they're pulling from a well and the well water level has dropped significantly this year, pull again mid-season. Do your due diligence for that grower. Next step would be to run a distribution uniformity test. So that just gives you a nice baseline to see how the irrigation system is performing and helps you identify if there are problems within the water that oftentimes the grower's not even noticing that there are issues. If your distribution uniformity test is low, a field cleanout would be recommended to help open up those emitters and clean those lines. Next step would be to retest your distribution uniformity. So I like to do this just so the fact that the grower is able to see the performance increase. So the field cleanouts aren't free. So the grower should be realizing that what they're putting money towards is actually working. Next would be to tailor fit a plan to maximize efficiency. And by doing this, you're going to help choose the right chemistry. So water analysis are all different, and water treatment is not one size fits all. It's definitely a tailor fit program. So make sure whoever you're choosing to work with is doing a tailor fit program for your water. And the next would be to maintain and retest when needed. So by maintain, you're probably going to want to be recommending a maintenance product or sulfuric acid if you've got high bicarbonates, or hydrogen peroxide product if you have bacteria present in the water. And then retest when needed. Again, when I talked about the well levels dropping, retest the water as often as you feel needed and the grower feels needed. So water analysis. So each lab is entirely different. So I do suggest that you choose a lab that fits your needs and build a good relationship with the people at the lab. So the lab we use provides this analysis for me, and I particularly like it because I work with growers that are both analytical and visual. So this provides that. They are able to look at the figures, or if they're more visual, they can look down at the charts and see the low, moderate, and high levels and know when treatment needs to be applied. This particular lab I use also does a bacteria count, and I highly recommend finding a lab that does a bacteria count as well. A lot of times distribution uniformity will decrease because there is that bacteria in the water, and it is creating the biofilm within the lines. And without having that colony forming unit measurement, you're not going to know that there is bacteria in the lines. Another thing I did when I started working with this lab was reached out to them and asked for guidelines of what certain thresholds are, so I can explain that to the grower. And then I also recommend asking the lab what days they run certain analysis. So I know this lab in particular runs water analysis on Tuesdays and Fridays. So I know if I want to get a water sample back sooner than that typical week that it takes to get one back, I'll drive it down to Madera and drop it off Monday night or Thursday night to ensure that I'll be getting the results back that same week. So definitely don't hesitate to ask those questions. So getting into distribution uniformity. So again, distribution uniformity is a method to measure the irrigation system's performance. So commonly when I'm doing a distribution uniformity test, I'm testing on fixed sprinklers, micro sprinklers, or drip irrigation. So when you run the test, you'll get a figure, a percentage essentially. And if your figure, these are the typical ranges that you want to stay around. So 95% is where you would want your drip or your micro system to be running at. And for fixed sprinklers, it's got a little bit bigger of an orifice, so 85% is fine. However, if your results are falling below, then it just means that your irrigation water is not being evenly applied. And if you do fertigation, you can also bet that your fertilizer is not being evenly applied. So when the distribution uniformities fall below that desired rate, this should result in a field cleanout followed by a maintenance recommendation. So here's a visual image of what distribution uniformity looks like. So the top photo, the top portion of the photo, excuse me, is showing very poor uniformity. So some trees are being overwatered, some trees are being underwatered. And if you are again fertigating, you can bet that they're also being over fertilized and under fertilized. B is showing that there is a lot of uniformity, but it's not necessarily efficient because you're past the root zone and you're overwatering. So again, if you are doing fertilizer injections, you're having your fertilizer go past the root zone. So essentially it's the tree's not able to uptake all that they should. C is a perfect world. So the right amount of water and it's in the right spot. So to test for distribution uniformity, my company offers this complimentary to all of our growers and to any prospects we have. I'm not certain if there are a lot of irrigation companies that offer this, but it can never hurt to ask. So the goal is to pick a number divisible by 4. 24 is the minimum that I've read, and this is based off of the UC Davis standards. And then 40 is typically the highest. So we choose at Apollo Ag Technologies to do 36 emitters. So again, the number needs to be divisible by 4. And when you collect on those 36 emitters, for example, you're going to be catching water at each emitter for 30 seconds. I choose to use a graduated cylinder that has the measurements in milliliters. So when I get all those 36 readings, the goal is to calculate the lowest average. So 4 divided by 36 is 9. So the 9 lowest outputs, I'm going to divide whatever that total is into the total average, and that's going to provide me with a percentage. So the 0.95 or the 0.85 that was described before. So how can you improve your distribution uniformity? So again, depending on the distribution uniformity test and the water analysis, those are the 2 key things you need before making any recommendation. And if a water treatment company you're working with or a crop advisor or a farmer says otherwise, I would ask them why. Again, you want to do your due diligence and make sure that you're putting the appropriate product out there. And again, they're all different. So again, depending on the distribution uniformity results and the water analysis, you'll most likely be recommended either a single or a dual product clean out. So the single product, it's going to go off that water analysis. So if you have high bicarbonates and no bacteria, then you'd probably get away with just an acidifier to break down those bicarbonates. If you have high bacteria and bicarbonates that are under 120 parts per million, which is typically where you want to start treatment, you might be able to get away with just a peracetic acid or hydrogen peroxide. More often than not, I have all my growers having both issues, unfortunately. So we end up doing that 2-part clean out. So the first would be to, whether they're conventional or organic, we would use an acidifier. And that's going to help with that scale remediation. So we like to drop the pH to about a 2.5 to a 3 and hold it for about an hour and a half to 2 hours and allow those bicarbonates to break down, things to move through the line, and then come back through with either hydrogen peroxide or peracetic acid. And that's going to depend on the severity of the bacteria. That's going to treat the biofilm within the line. And then you flush the line 24 hours after. And then I always recommend doing a distribution uniformity retest, again, just so the growers have proof that there is progress being made. And then lastly, you should make an appropriate maintenance recommendation. So I really like this photo. Again, I'm a visual person. So if, for example, this distribution uniformity had a score of 65, you can see I don't know if you guys ever take apart the risers. If you unscrew the riser, you can see these filters, and oftentimes they will have some slime growing up on there. So that's a great example. And then when they obviously cut the emitter open, so you can see all the biofilm on the inside and all the plugging at the emitter. They did a field clean out, retested. They got a 90 on the distribution uniformity test, which is fantastic. And you can see how clean everything is on the inside now. So just to summarize what we just talked about, the goal is to fix and to control. So again, pull your water samples to identify what the issues are. Do a distribution uniformity test just to establish your baseline. Even if the water sample looks great, again, let's do our due diligence for our growers and ourselves and get that baseline established. Pick the right chemistry to ensure proper remediation. So if we're going to have to do that field clean out, again, it's not one size fits all. And then when you do that field clean out, again, retest at the end. The control, again, we're going to probably start with that field clean out. and then treat with biomaintenance chemistries determined by the water quality. Again, this is all going to be shown on that water analysis that we take. Treat with scale reducing products, so sulfuric acid, citric acid, sulfur burners, whatever is your growers going to fix their problems and meet the goals on their farm. And then retest water as needed. I know I said it early on, but I can't stress it enough. Water levels and quality have changed drastically out west this year. It's no sweat off my back to retest water for my growers. I have some growers that like to have their water sample done twice a year, and I'm happy to do that for them. It gives them peace of mind and it makes me relevant on their farm. So I don't know where all of you are located. We do have reps throughout the state of California that are happy to help you guys answer questions, do those complimentary DUs for you, pull those complimentary water samples. I'm up yellow. My counterpart is down in the green area. We've got representatives on the Central Coast and in the gray as well. But again, if you want to reach out to me, I'm happy to point you in the right direction on who to contact. And if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer those for you.
Molly, well done. My quick question is, if we take a photo of that QR code, what is that gonna, where's that gonna take us?
That's a great question, Carl. Thank you. That actually takes you to our Apollo Ag Tech website. So that again has our contact information on there. It actually gives you the option to text off your computer, to text the representative in your area. It goes over our entire portfolio and a few other things as well.
Molly, thank you. We have some time for questions, so please type them into the Q&A. I've had some messages come over my phone's text message, so I'll read them off to you. Molly, you made a really good point about the connection between distribution uniformity on the delivery of water to the crop and the fertilizer to the crop. So it's like this great Venn diagram. If I were a better artist, I would draw it, but it would just look like squiggles. Is there like a time of year where it's like the best time to call up somebody who provides this service to come do a DU? Is there like a time where you can really have an impact on that end of season yield result or quality? Any comments on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So again, it's kind of going to depend on the growers' farming practices and what they're growing. I do have some growers that choose to winterize the system, if you will. They like to do a big clean out at the end of the year when they're done putting gyp through the lines and all that stuff, and make sure the lines are squeaky clean, shut it down for winter, and then fire it up back up in the spring. I'll take another water sample and kind of give them that baseline. But then again, I have growers that say, hey, let's hold off. We'll revisit in the springtime when I fire up the system again. So it's just going to depend on what the grower prefers. So I would say best case scenario, winter or spring. You don't necessarily want to do it mid-season, because by the time you're doing it mid-season, you're essentially putting out a fire, right? Like you're doing that field clean out mid-season because there's an issue that you're finally noticing. So let's stay ahead of the issues together, so you don't have to put those fires out. So winter or spring for maintenance cleanouts would be ideal.
That's a great point. Not waiting till the fire is there to do something, right?
Yeah.
You mentioned that you worked with your lab to make sure that water sample had some interpretation on that. How often do you see water samples that are just big blobs of numbers and whatnot? And
all the time.
How much of a struggle was it to get the interpretation added to the sample?
Actually, this lab provided that already, so I didn't necessarily have to have them make any special adjustments, but just from my PCA days and then working with PCAs, they'll share their water analysis with me, and some are really easy to read and some aren't. But again, if you have that grower that's visual or that is analytical, I think it's important to provide them with both. And then a lot of labs don't do that colony forming unit test because it's expensive. So that's going to be another one of those factors that makes your water one of those weak links, is that bacteria. So it's best to work with a lab that offers that.
Yeah, great point. We got some questions in the chat here, Molly. Let me just look at them really quick. Molly, what injection devices do you like for drip system cleaners?
I'm not really following that question well. Are you meaning what type of pump would I use or what type of cleaner would I use?
I think it's how are you getting it into the system? How do you get it
Okay.
into the drip system?
So it's going to depend on what the product is. If we're going with a sulfuric acid, for example, that'll be injected post-filter below ground. I use Grundfos pumps. If we're doing like a maintenance product where we have, those typical blue drums you see, that's going to be injected pre-filter with a smaller DDA pump.
Okay.
So again, that's Grundfos as well. Those are just my pump preferences. There's other great ones out there, LMI, for example. And then if you are doing the field clean out, we would bring, and I'm sure a lot of other water treatment companies do this, we bring the product, we bring the injection pump, and we will inject post filter into the ports. We'll pull the water out, the pump will put it back in and throw the chemical in there as well.
Thank you.
I answered your question.
Yeah, the audience member who asked that, hope that cleared that up. If not, please type in the Q&A if you have any need for clarification. Molly, a second question. Does EC, the electrical conductivity, influence this kind of irrigation analysis on the DU?
Not necessarily on the factors that I'm looking at for the DU. You should absolutely request that be on your lab result as well. So again, when you are getting that water analysis, make sure it is complete, because that's a very important one on there.
Great point. And that is Aaron Wingate will talk here in a few minutes about the EC piece of water samples. So great point on the completeness of a water sample. We've got two more questions. One is on if a grower's using canal water, there's a comment that it's not worth the time to check canal water. Maybe it's not as variable or as problematic. Any advice on maybe the source of the water relative to the sampling frequency or scheme?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the way I operate is if I have growers that are able to use well or canal district water, I will take a sample from each and just let them know, or have them let me know when they're running so we can get that analysis. And if they are using an acidifier, we will run a titration on both waters so we know where to adjust the pump so that they're not overfeeding or underfeeding. But then also with our company, we have a service technician that visits every site that we have water treatment set up on bi-weekly, and he generates a report and he's testing residuals of the bacteria products and also of the pH. So he'll make those adjustments when he checks the residual. If there's not as much bacteria in the canal water that was in the well water, and it'll tell him on his meter whether we're overfeeding or underfeeding. So he'll make those adjustments to make sure that we're hitting that like 0.3 parts per million residual at the end of the line.
Okay.
So definitely treat them as separate. And if, the canal water is pure and perfect, then we are happy to shut our pumps off while you're running that.
If you have some pure, perfect canal water, please send that down south. We need some of it. One last question. I think you've hit this. There's a question about the source of the water, a well, a ditch, or maybe a blended well and ditch water source. It sounds like what you're saying is that the water sample can help direct the custom program that a grower might need, because all the water is going to be so different. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, that's correct. And if you do have the opportunity to use well water, canal water, or blend it, let's say in a reservoir, absolutely ask whoever's pulling your water samples to test them separately, so that you know how to make the appropriate recommendations and dose certain things as you go along throughout the season.
Excellent. Well, there aren't any more questions. We got through like 6 of them or 5 of them, I think. So well done. Great job, Molly. Thanks for sharing your knowledge about the distribution uniforming and how to fix the issue, how to diagnose it. I think that's great advice. I think your advice on do it before there's a distribution uniformity, like July, where you really see it in the trees or the plants. Great advice. And for those of you in the audience that have more questions, we will share Molly's contact information. Molly, you don't mind if some folks contact you for more information, do you?
Nope, please do. And don't hesitate to share my information either with your growers if they have questions. So I appreciate everybody's time and those that ask questions. Thanks, Karl.
Thanks, Molly. Have a good one. So up next, we'll bring Aaron Wingate from TriTech out in Camarillo, California. And we had that question about EC. Like I didn't see, the question was, I didn't see EC on the report. Aaron's going to talk about EC, what it means and why it matters. So Aaron, I'll turn the stage over to you for our final segment on salinity management. So the floor is yours.
All right, here we go. All right, well, thank you for the introduction, Karl. Again, my name is Erin Wingate, and I work for TriTech Ag Products in Ventura County, California. And here, the salinity issue in the irrigation water and the soil is a big deal and getting worse, as we've heard throughout the talks today. And so I'm going to talk to you about why the water quality of the irrigation water matters so much to the soil quality, what we should be looking out for, and how to prevent further soil degradation, and how to treat it if we already have some issues. So this is a quote many of you have probably heard before, but FDR said, "The nation that destroys its soil destroys itself." And I've got some statistics for you. 10 million hectares of land are lost every year due to soil salinization or sodification. And that comes out to 5% of arable lands and 23% of cultivated lands are already saline. 8% of arable lands and 39% of cultivated lands are sodic. And we'll get into the differences between sodic and saline soils in a little bit here. FDR was talking about the Dust Bowl and everything that was happening to those Midwestern soils, but this is still a terrible problem in lots of places. And this photo is current, and it's in Montana, and this whole area just can't support plant growth very well anymore because of the salinization. And so we want to understand why, and how does water play into it? So this water chemistry drives soil salinity. Over time, when we fertilize and irrigate, even if we have pretty decent water quality, especially in our arid environment, those salts are going to build up, and we've got to take steps to make sure we're leaching them down and preventing the soil from degrading to the point where it can't support our crops. So salt buildup leads to poor water penetration and infiltration, the loss of soil aggregation and pore structure, which then leads to low aeration. So if our soil isn't flocculating and creating these aggregates and pore spaces, then it's very difficult for water and fertilizer and oxygen to move through to keep those roots healthy. And then we can also have low nutrient availability due to the pH and the nutrients we most need precipitating out of solution. And we have limited yield potential because of the salinity directly increasing osmotic potential to the point where plants aren't able to absorb the water and nutrients that they need. And then we can have direct toxicity from some of the salt constituents, the sodium, chloride, and boron. So what are the sources of salts? We've kind of been going over this all afternoon here. So we've got the different cations and anions, and these salts influence soil quality in different ways, and their concentration in the water and their relative concentrations to each other impact the severity of any potential issues. So I'm going to just continue to plug the sampling message. We got to get those water samples, and we also need soil tests. And I've just thrown up on the screen some of the important things to look at when you're trying to deal with salinity. And also the type of soil test you take matters. you want to get at the exchangeable cations and the cation exchange capacity, but you also want to get a saturated paste. So we'll get into the differences between those sampling or testing methods and why you should have both. Many labs already do, and you'll see it on the report: exchangeable calcium and total calcium or solution calcium. So one of the major factors that we're looking at when we're trying to understand whether the soil is salt affected and how is the exchangeable sodium percentage. And that is the percent of sodium that's occupying the cation exchange sites. So we've got clay particles in our soil that have the negative charge, and they're attracting positively charged cations. And that's basically your bank account of nutrients. And in a healthy soil, we want calcium to be the dominant cation on those clay surfaces and in solution. And we get some structural degradation when sodium is becoming more and more of the dominant cation. And so this is just calculation of how to get it. It can be measured directly if the lab is measuring the exchangeable cations on the CEC. If the lab didn't do that exchangeable extraction method, if instead they did a saturated paste with distilled water, then they're measuring the sodium adsorption ratio. And you can use that number to calculate ESP. So the sodium adsorption ratio is a water measurement. And this is the calculation for it. And just so that you have it, if you have the SAR, but not the ESP, you can do the calculation from the previous slide backwards to get that number that you want. So whichever way you get it, you want to know at least an estimate of the percent sodium on those exchange sites, because you want to look at your soil EC, pH, and ESP to determine whether you're dealing with a saline sodic or saline sodic in worst case soil. So if the ESP is less than 15%, meaning sodium is occupying less than 15% of the exchange sites, but your electrical conductivity is above 4 decisiemens per meter, and your pH is below 8.5, then you're classified as saline. And you might not have structural problems in the soil, but you will have other issues and limited yield potential depending on the crop. A sodic soil has very bad structural problems. It's lost its porosity, its aggregation. It's very difficult to get water to penetrate into the soil and then to infiltrate and move laterally. And you've got a sodic soil. If your ESP is above 15%, EC is less than 4, but pH is usually above 8.5 in this case. And then saline sodic is like, you've got high electrical conductivity and a very high percent sodium on those exchange sites. So these classifications are showing like pretty bad issues, especially for the sodic soil. It doesn't gain that sodic classification until ESP is above 15%, but we see structure degrading when ESP is above 6%. So what is a sodic soil? This is a photo of one when it's dried out. It forms these like really big clods that are just difficult to work with, hard to get water in there, difficult to tell. And this high sodium can cause phytotoxicity depending on the crop. And the structure really just limits the root health overall, and over time can lead to the photo shown in the first picture. And so how does sodium do that? So in this upper photo, we're seeing clay particles where the sodium is the cation, and sodium has a very large shell of water surrounding it. And so when it fills all of these negatively charged sites on the clay surface, it starts to push the clay particles apart. And as they're pushed apart, they're swelling and dispersing, destroying the aggregates. And so you lose that flocculation. Calcium has a much smaller shell of water around it, and it allows the soil to remain in those nice aggregates that you want, that create the pore space to let water move through the soil evenly and still allow water to get in and air to get in. When a sodic soil is wet, the surface becomes very sticky, and kind of think of a mud pie where there's really no structure there, and it becomes water resistant. So if we let the problem get out of hand, it then becomes harder to fix because we can't get the water into the soil to help leach it. And so the remediation ends up being kind of a long process. So this is really something we want to prevent, actively prevent. So sodium toxicity, this is also a big issue if you're using sprinkler irrigation, where you can get foliar injury. And this is a chart just showing how different crops have different sensitivities to sodium or chloride in the irrigation water. So sodium accumulates in the leaf tissue, which causes tip burn. And it is hard to distinguish sodium toxicity specifically from chloride toxicity or just an overall high EC. So you want to combine all of your lab tests, look at your water, look at the soil, and then take leaf tissue analyses as well to see how your water and soil is impacting the crop. Crops that are grown in a soil where sodium is dominating the cation exchange can develop other nutrient deficiencies as well. Calcium might end up being a problem if the situation is severe enough. And if the irrigation water pH is above 8.3, that's also a sign that sodium is likely to be the dominant cation in your water that's associated with carbonate. So then the sodic soil is all about the sodium. What is a saline soil and how is that impacting soil and crop health? So this one is high in total salts, but sodium isn't the dominant cation. Plants need to expend more energy to absorb water and nutrients due to that high osmotic potential. So if the salt concentration outside of the roots is very high, the plants are having a much harder time absorbing nutrients. And then that can cause phytotoxicity, as we saw before. And chloride, for instance, has a higher toxicity than sulfate. So you want to know what's driving the high EC. If it's sulfate or if it's bicarbonates, that's not going to be as toxic to the plants as chloride. And then you also want to look at the crop that you're growing, because every crop has a different sensitivity. So this is a really good resource from UCANR. you can go onto their website and they've got a very extensive list of crops, their salinity threshold, and how yield decreases with increasing EC. So that's the slope column in this chart. That's showing, okay, if my EC is going to go from 1.5 to 3, you can estimate the potential yield loss you would get from that. And so you can get this yield loss even without showing the severe tip burn. So sometimes this ends up being a silent problem that goes undiagnosed, but still you're losing out on some potential crop production. And then I also wanted to mention here that in general, you start having a problem when EC is above 0.75 and a very severe above 3 for a lot of crops. And I want to talk about carbonates and bicarbonates. This is pretty interesting. They are the main drivers of high pH. They have this big buffering capacity. And at the same time, they're also contributing to the EC. So it's kind of a two problem in one. When you've got a high pH, most of the micronutrients have very limited availability, especially iron. And you also have low phosphorus availability. And then you can also get calcium precipitating out of solution. So when the irrigation water is high in carbonates and bicarbonates, those are going into the soil, and in the soil they encounter calcium, and then they react to form calcium carbonate, which has very low solubility, meaning once it precipitates out, it's hard to get it back into solution. And so that calcium is essentially lost from the cation exchange. And in its place, sodium usually takes its spot, and sometimes potassium as the dominant cation. So over time, if we're irrigating with water high in carbonates and bicarbonates, that will eventually lead to structural problems as the exchangeable sodium percentage increases. So you want to look at your water test and see where your bicarbonates are. And then you also want to see if your water has any sodium, then look at the soil and see what the ESP is. And if you have lab reports from 5 years ago or 1 or 2 years ago, look back at that, because then you can start to track how the soil is changing over time and how quickly. I think as soon as you see that this could be a potential issue, it's worth treating, not just to prevent the soil from becoming sodic, but also because as soon as you get rid of those carbonates and bicarbonates, you'll have much better fertilizer efficiency. You'll have better phosphorus availability, better micronutrient availability, and you'll be reducing your electrical conductivity, which reduces the stress on the crops. And so then next, we've got sulfates in our water a lot of the time, and sulfates contribute to the total salinity, but they don't directly affect soil structure. So that's one positive. If it's sulfates driving that EC, you don't have to worry so much about soil degradation, but you do need to include leaching in the soil management. It also has relatively low direct toxicity to plants. So compared with chloride, for example, you can have fairly high levels of sulfate, but if your EC is still I don't know, between like 1 and 3, depending on the crop, it's not going to be as bad of a problem as it would be if it was a different salt driving that EC. Sulfate also binds with calcium. And so if you really want to get rid of that sulfate, and your pH is neutral to somewhat alkaline in the soil, applying calcium fertilizer like CN9 CAN17, some of that sulfate will precipitate out of solution. Whether or not you want to do that or whether it's relevant is a different story, because maybe your goal is to get your pH closer to neutral or slightly acid. So then I'm going to talk about some of the toxic constituents. First one is boron, and it's tricky because it's absolutely necessary for the crop. It's an essential nutrient and it's very important for pollination, but it has a very narrow optimum range in the soil. It is sufficient for crop production when it is above 0.05 parts per million. And then different crops have different toxicity thresholds. So those that are very sensitive start to show toxicity above 0.3, and then moderately sensitive 0.4, tolerant 0.5. And then there are also numbers that you can look at for sufficiency and toxicity in the irrigation water itself. So it's sufficient above 0.02. And then you can see the numbers for when it becomes toxic. So you can find these numbers in the Western Fertilizer Handbook. And if you haven't gotten the new edition yet, you should. It's really good. It's got tons of charts that I've included in this presentation, plus more that didn't have time to add in. But it can help a whole lot in dealing with salinity and figuring out how to match your remediation strategy with the crop that you're going to grow. And then also boron, if we need to get rid of it because it's gotten too high in soil, it can be leached eventually, but just note that it is not as mobile in soil as chloride or nitrate. So it's going to take multiple leachings to get it to move down. So then the next toxic one is chloride. And then I also wanted to mention chlorine. And sometimes chlorine is in the irrigation water if maybe you're getting it from a city source. And chlorine is highly toxic at very low concentration. But the good news is that it decomposes very quickly in the presence of organic matter. And so if you know your water has chlorine in it, try to include some mulch or maybe even some liquid fertilizer, liquid organic fertilizer, or a humic acid type product. And you can inject very small rates of that with your fertilizer. You can set it up for continuous injection if needed. But if you know that chlorine's an issue, we just need some organic matter and problem solved. The chloride, on the other hand, that can leach, but when our water is so limited, people don't have the excess water all the time to do the leachings that would help a sensitive crop. Then also the perennials are most sensitive to chloride because it accumulates in their woody tissue. So get that water test, and if you've got the high chlorides, prioritize that water use a couple times a year or however often is needed to keep chloride levels from getting so high that it's impacting your crop production. And you can tell that by getting leaf tissue analyses and getting soil tests. All right, so then salinity management, I've been mentioning some of those strategies as we go. The first is figure out whether you should treat your irrigation water. And then always remember, the only way to get rid of the salts is to leach them. There aren't any products out there that you can apply that will remove them. You got to leach them down eventually. You can use a soil surfactant to improve water infiltration and lateral flow if your soil has structural issues. That can help a lot with distribution uniformity. And then other mitigation strategies depend on the type of salt driving the salinity, and it depends on the soil chemistry to begin with. So you always want to look at your lab reports together and think through how your treatment options are going to affect the water, and then how that water is going to impact the soil. And then lastly, you want to maintain or improve yields by adjusting the fertilizer applications according to how the soil and water quality limit nutrient availability. So you can have that leaching fraction, calcium applications, acidification, adjuvants, humic acids, we talked about that, organic matter. And for the fertilizer, you want to include chelated micronutrients if the pH is high. The leaching requirement. A lot of people I talk to, when they want to leach salts down below the root zone, they're like, okay, well, we'll just run the water for like 4 more hours. But if we want to address the problem in a more specific way and have some peace of mind that we're using our water most effectively, it's not that difficult to calculate the specific amount you should require given the crop you're growing and the EC of the water. So you can find this calculation also in the Western Fertilizer Handbook and lots of other places, but the leaching requirement is the amount of additional water that's needed. So you take the EC of your water and divide it by 5 times the crop tolerance threshold, which you can look up, minus the EC of the water again. And then the total water required is that evapotranspiration of your crop divided by 1 minus the leaching requirement. So acid treatments, when should you use them? You should use them when you've got high carbonates and bicarbonates in the irrigation water. That'll drop down the pH and reduce some of the salinity. And also, if you already have a sodic or saline sodic soil containing free lime. And there are lots of acid sources, but we're going to kind of look at sulfuric acid here as an example, where you've got calcium carbonate plus sulfuric acid. You're releasing calcium and sulfate and getting water and carbon dioxide, which then vaporizes. Then that leaves the calcium to go back into the soil. So we've run out of time really here to go through this calculation, but you can take a screenshot, or this presentation might be available later and you can always contact me. But we have a sodic soil without calcium carbonate, without free lime in the soil. So if you did a little acid test, you're not getting that fizz. And so in order to replace the sodium with calcium, you want to use gypsum. and you can use the numbers on your soil test to calculate exactly how much gypsum you need. And then you can test your gypsum source to figure out its purity, and then add additional to make up for the impurity in the product. So this calculation is based on an assumption that 100% of that calcium, the sulfate, is calcium sulfate. And a sodic soil that does contain lime, you don't have to use as much gypsum or gypsum at all if the soil already has free calcium carbonate. Instead, you can use an acid to break up the calcium carbonate, release the calcium, and then that will be available to replace sodium. So it's important to know this. It'll save your customer money and address other issues at the same time if you're treating the issue appropriately. And you can apply elemental sulfur, as in the example on the last slide, and you can also acidify the water directly. Acidifying the water, we should remember, though, it will take time to see a big effect on the soil. And then the importance of organic matter, this is relevant here too, not only to get rid of any chlorine that's in the water, but also because organic matter increases cation and anion exchange capacity, and it improves soil structure, water holding capacity, all of those good things. I'm just gonna kind of breeze through this, but nutrient management, remember that fertilizers are salts, and make sure you're adding just the amount that your crop needs and not over applying, because that will just exacerbate the EC issue and cause more stress than good. And then next, just keep in mind that pH and make sure you're chelating the nutrients that require it if you've got a high pH. So the conclusions: take samples and consider all of the pools of salinity and alkalinity, meaning what's in the water, what's in the soil, what's in the leaf tissue. Tailor the remediation strategy to the crop that's being grown, soil and water chemistry, and take the grower's practices and budget into account, because sometimes you might think that you have exactly the right solution, but it just might not work out logistically or with their budget. And then this one's important too. You want to track your progress. So if you decide that you want to do a continuous acid injection, you should take a sample of the water at the end of the drip tape to make sure that your acid is being dosed in at the right rate. And then take more soil samples, and like every year, take water samples once or twice a year, just to keep an eye on what's going on and see if you need to make adjustments. And here's some resources: Western Fertilizer Handbook. Everybody probably has soil fertility and fertilizers from college. This is a link to UCA&R salinity management, and another resource from FAO. So thank you so much. I know that was really quick, especially at the end there, but I'll open it up to questions.
Erin, thank you. That's great.
Thank you.
Good look at all the different crop tolerances for salinity. Some are super tough, some are not so tough.
Yep.
If you're in your neck of the woods, you get to see all that range. We have a couple questions. One question is, can we improve water penetration in a sodic saline soil by running calcium thiosulfate through the drip irrigation system? What are your thoughts and experience with that?
Yeah, a lot of people use cats for that calcium, and it does work to help flocculate the soil. You are getting free ionic calcium, And whether or not that's the best option just depends on if the soil has such a high EC that it's having a hard time tolerating more sulfate. If the EC isn't so much of a problem, calcium thiosulfate can be a good choice because the thiosulfate has a slight ability to decrease soil pH. So as with so many of these things, the answer is just, it depends.
Yeah. And that's how I know you're a good agronomist, Erin. One more question about saline conditions. The question is, what happens if you split fertilizer applications under saline conditions? Can splitting the fertilizer help manage that total EC?
Absolutely, yes. And you should, because you don't want your fertilizer injection to just give this huge burst of salt pressure when you're trying to nourish the crop. You don't want to shock it with a very high EC. So you can look at the EC after injecting the fertilizer. Go to the end of the drip tape and get a sample and see what is that EC, and try to keep it under different thresholds depending on what the crop is.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that knowledge and sharing your experience and for your advice on getting that water sample and figuring out the right path forward. That's fantastic. Erin, if you wouldn't mind us to stop sharing your screen. I don't see any more questions. I did post all the contact information for our presenters today in the chat. If you do have more questions, please contact them. If you want to show your appreciation for our presenters, please make use of that reaction button in Zoom and give some thumbs up and give some hand claps. Everyone likes that. Maybe this person that's really happy with tears coming out of their eyes because they've learned so much today on a Friday. That's a great way to look at it. But now we get to the end of our presentation. We do have that QR code up. Please use your CCA app to scan that if you have it, and you'll get those credits right away. If you don't have it, you can rest assured we will get that list to HQ in Madison, and they will add your credit hours here over the next few weeks. So if you need it instantly, like you're really sweating your hours, that's where the QR code comes in. If you've got a little more time, that's where you can wait for the list to get posted. One thing I wanted to do was invite all of you folks. If you're looking for 4 more hours of CCA credits, we have them at www.wrcca.org/continuing ed. It's right there on the screen there. You can go get more credit hours, very interesting speakers and topics that are tailored for our region. I also add that you contact our speakers. And if you want to follow the CCA program, you're more than welcome to. Please visit our website. I mentioned that earlier. We're also on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. We're hitting all the channels up, and we're coming to where you folks are at with good content. And it's a great way to engage in the broader organization. I'd like to thank our speakers one more time. And I'd also like to thank the audience. Thank you for making time on a Friday to learn and to get into this agronomy of water concept. I think it's super important. And I think we've covered all the great reasons to go take water samples. There's lots of issues that you can be taking a look at to provide value for your growers and for your customers, and to become a great, an even better CCA at the same time. So with that, I'll wish you a great weekend, and we'll catch you next time. Thank you.